Paul Hogan spent decades making the world laugh as the fearless Australian who seemed to have an answer for everything. He carried a knife, wore a battered hat, and walked through the outback with the confidence of a man who could never be surprised. But behind the character was a very different story. A man who found fame almost by accident, built a family before the world knew his name, became one of the biggest comedy stars on the planet, and then watched some of the most important relationships in his life slowly disappear. Now, at 86, the story of Paul Hogan is no longer really about Crocodile Dundee. It is about what remained after the crowds went home. For years, people have wondered which woman truly held the deepest place in Hogan's heart. Was it Nolene Edwards, the teenage sweetheart who stood beside him before fame, money, and Hollywood? Or was it Linda Kozlowski, the actress who entered his life when he was already married and became the woman the entire world associated with his greatest success? The answer is more complicated than a simple love story. Because sometimes the person who changes your life is not the same person who knew you before the world changed you. Long before Paul Hogan became an international star, he was simply a young man trying to make a living in Western Sydney. Born in 1939, he grew up without the kind of advantages that would suggest a future in entertainment. He worked as a rigger on the Sydney Harbour Bridge and took other jobs, including work as a lifeguard, while trying to build a life. Then, in 1958, when he was only 19, he met an 18-year-old woman named Nolene Edwards. There was nothing glamorous about the beginning. No Hollywood studio. No red carpet. No famous friends. Just two young people who liked each other and decided to get married. Hogan later described himself as a flirt who liked Nolene and discovered that she liked him too. That was enough. They married that same year. Before Paul had even reached his 20s, he was already a father. By his early 20s, he and Nolene had 3 sons. Their life was built around ordinary responsibilities. Work, children, bills, a home, the endless demands that come with raising a family. And this matters because Nolene did not meet Paul Hogan after he became Paul Hogan. She met the man before the character existed. She knew him when he was still trying to figure out what he was going to do with his life. She saw the version of him that had no international fame to offer, and no reason to believe that millions of people would one day know his name. For years, that ordinary life was enough. Then everything changed. In 1971, Hogan appeared on the Australian television talent program New Faces. He was not there in the traditional sense of trying to prove himself as a performer. Instead, he turned the situation upside down. He mocked the judges, used his workman's personality as part of the act, and discovered something that would eventually become his greatest weapon. People loved watching him refuse to take fame seriously. That simple attitude became the foundation of his television career. The Paul Hogan Show followed, and suddenly the rigger from Western Sydney was becoming a national celebrity. But fame has a strange way of changing the meaning of time. The more successful Hogan became, the more often he was away. Television required travel. Public appearances followed. Then came international attention. The family life that had once revolved around ordinary routines now had to compete with a career that seemed to be moving faster every year. Nolene was still there, raising the children and watching the man she had married become famous. From the outside, it might have looked exciting. From inside a marriage, fame can look very different. It can mean empty rooms, long absences, and watching strangers receive the parts of someone you used to have all to yourself. By 1981, after more than 2 decades together, Paul and Nolene divorced. Yet the story did not end there. Less than a year later, they reconciled and remarried. That decision says something about how complicated their bond had become. Whatever had pulled them apart had not erased the history between them. They had spent most of their adult lives together. They had raised children together. They had survived the years when Paul had very little. And perhaps some part of both of them believed that history could still be enough. For a time, it seemed possible. But then came Crocodile Dundee. In 1985, Paul Hogan traveled into the Australian outback to make a film he had helped create. The movie was supposed to be a gamble. Instead, it became the role that transformed his career forever. And on that production, he met Linda Kozlowski. Linda was an American actress with serious training and a very different background from Hogan. She had studied at Juilliard, worked on Broadway, and arrived in Australia ready to play the female lead. The conditions were difficult. The production took place in environments where insects, snakes, heat, and crocodiles were part of everyday reality. Yet Linda continued working. And something else was developing. According to people around the production, Hogan and Kozlowski began growing closer as filming continued. The director later described the two as understanding each other more and more. Others around them noticed the connection as well. There was one enormous complication. Paul Hogan was still married to Nolene. That is where the story stopped being a simple Hollywood romance and became something much more painful. Crocodile Dundee was released in 1986 and became a worldwide phenomenon. The film made Hogan an international star and turned Linda Kozlowski into a recognizable actress almost overnight. The chemistry audiences saw on screen was no longer only acting. Soon, Hogan and Nolene's marriage was over for good. The second divorce became a public spectacle. Newspapers followed it. People chose sides. A private family crisis became entertainment for strangers. And Nolene, the woman who had known Hogan since he was a teenager, was suddenly forced into a story she had never asked to be part of. Yet one statement attributed to her captured the emotional complexity of what she had lost. She said she had the best years of his life. There was no need for a dramatic speech. Those words said enough. She had been there when he had nothing. She had been there before the fame. She had been there before Hollywood. And then she had watched someone else become the partner of the man the world now wanted to know. For years afterward, Paul and Nolene reportedly remained estranged. The transcript of his story describes a period of roughly 17 years when they did not speak. Think about what that means. 17 years is not a chapter in a marriage. It is almost an entire second life. Children grow older. Families change. People become grandparents. Memories become photographs. The person you once knew as a teenager becomes an elderly man. And yet the silence remains. Nolene eventually rebuilt her own life. She later married Reg Stretton and found a quieter kind of happiness away from the entertainment industry. Her story became less visible because she had never been the one seeking attention. Paul, meanwhile, married Linda Kozlowski in 1990. To the public, the wedding seemed like the natural conclusion to one of the decade's most famous romances. The couple had met while making the film that changed both their lives, and now they were married. For a while, the relationship appeared genuinely affectionate. Hogan openly praised Linda. He described her in glowing terms and spoke about how beautiful she was. They continued working in the same cinematic world, and the success of Crocodile Dundee 2 only strengthened the image of them as one of Hollywood's unusual couples. But behind the success, another tension was developing. Linda had her own ambitions. She had trained seriously as an actress. She did not want to spend the rest of her career simply playing the girlfriend of a famous comedian. After Crocodile Dundee, she reportedly rejected roles she considered limiting or demeaning. She continued working for a time, but the projects that followed did not give her the kind of career she had imagined when she trained as an actress. Eventually, she stepped away. Their son, Chance, was born in 1998. Linda later described herself as happy and content with her life as a mother. But contentment can sometimes hide another emotion, the feeling that part of yourself has been placed on hold. As the years passed, reports emerged suggesting that Linda felt she had spent too long living in Hogan's shadow. That phrase is important, because Paul Hogan had spent his entire life becoming bigger. Linda had spent years becoming smaller within the public story of the Hogan family. He was the star. She was his wife. He was Crocodile Dundee. She was the woman beside him. Eventually, she wanted her own identity back. In 2013, Linda filed for divorce in Los Angeles, citing irreconcilable differences. Their marriage had lasted more than 2 decades. Their son was a teenager. And once again, Paul Hogan found himself watching a marriage disappear. This time, however, the woman leaving was not the same woman who had known him before fame. Linda had met the global star. She had experienced the Hollywood lifestyle. She had sacrificed parts of her own career. And when she finally walked away, she made it clear that she wanted to feel like herself again. The divorce settlement reportedly included a substantial one-time payment and allowed Linda to remain in their Los Angeles home for a period of time. Hogan retained the rights associated with Crocodile Dundee. Then Linda began another chapter. She traveled. She eventually met a Moroccan tour guide named Malay Hafid Baba. The connection developed quickly, and the two married in 2017. Linda moved toward a life that looked completely different from the one she had lived beside Hogan. For Paul, the aftermath was quieter. There were reports that he struggled with loneliness after Linda left. Whether every detail reported about his feelings was accurate is difficult to know, because Paul Hogan has often protected his private emotions with humor and understatement. That may be one of the reasons his story remains so compelling. The man who made millions laugh has rarely been comfortable explaining what hurts. When serious subjects appear, he often turns them into a joke. It is easier to make people laugh than to tell them you are afraid. Easier to make a clever comment than to admit you miss someone. Easier to talk about Crocodile Dundee than to talk about the marriages that ended behind the character. And then life began taking away the things fame could not protect. Hogan faced a long-running tax dispute with Australian authorities. The legal battle stretched across years and became another chapter in the complicated relationship between the comedian and his home country. Whatever the legal details, the experience was a reminder that money and celebrity do not guarantee peace. By his 80s, the physical realities of aging were also becoming impossible to ignore. The rugged image of the man who once crossed the screen with effortless confidence had begun to fade. Muscle loss, chronic pain, fewer public appearances, a body that could no longer keep up with the character people remembered. And suddenly, the question was no longer how much money Paul Hogan had made. It was what he had left. That is when the story becomes much more emotional. Because when you are young, you can believe that there will always be another year, another opportunity, another relationship, another chance to say what you meant. At 86, that illusion becomes harder to maintain. In December 2024, Hogan and Linda reunited publicly for a presentation connected to a restored version of Crocodile Dundee. Imagine what that moment must have felt like. Two people standing together again after years apart, looking at images of themselves from 1986. Young, beautiful, famous, untouchable. They were watching versions of themselves from almost 40 years earlier. The world saw nostalgia. But nostalgia is not always happy. Sometimes it is grief for a life that cannot be recovered. Hogan joked, as he often does. Humor gave him a safe place to stand. But beneath the laughter was a reminder that time had changed both of them. The faces on the screen belonged to people who had no idea what was coming. They could not know about the divorce. They could not know about the years of separation. They could not know about aging, loneliness, family problems, or the slow disappearance of the world that had made them famous. They only knew that they were young and in love. And perhaps that is why the question about the love of Hogan's life is so difficult. If he means Linda, there is a powerful argument. She was the woman connected to the defining chapter of his international fame. Their relationship began during the production that changed his career forever. They married, raised a son, shared years in America, and remained connected long after the marriage ended. But if he means Nolene, there is another argument. Nolene knew Paul Hogan before there was a Paul Hogan. She knew him when he was a young man, with a working-class job and no guarantee of success. She shared the years when money was limited. She helped raise their children while his career grew. She experienced the transition from ordinary life to extraordinary fame from the closest possible distance. And perhaps most importantly, she loved a version of Paul that the public never knew. That is a different kind of love. One is the love of the woman who stood beside the star. The other is the love of the woman who knew the man before he became one. And sometimes those two loves can both be real. Maybe that is the truth hidden inside Hogan's story. The title of his life is not really about choosing one woman over another. It is about realizing too late that every chapter of your life has a different kind of person attached to it. Nolene belonged to the beginning. Linda belonged to the years when the world was watching. And Paul himself belonged somewhere between them, trying to understand what fame had given him, and what it had quietly taken away. There is another painful detail in the story. His son Chance has remained part of his later life, and recent events involving the family have brought unwanted attention back to Hogan's home. In 2026, reports describe police being called to Hogan's Venice Beach residence in connection with a domestic incident involving Chance. At 86, Paul was once again standing outside his home while the machinery of fame and family collided. It is difficult to imagine a sharper contrast. The man who once stood confidently before millions of moviegoers was now an elderly father dealing with problems that no punchline could solve. And perhaps that is what makes his later years more human than his years of fame ever were. For decades, Paul Hogan was presented as the man who had everything. The money, the fame, the beautiful wife, the hit movies, the international recognition, the stories with celebrities, the impossible success of Crocodile Dundee. But success is not the same thing as fulfillment. You can have millions of people cheering for you and still come home to an empty room. You can have your face on posters and still miss the person who knew you before the posters existed. You can become famous for playing a man who always knows what to do while privately spending years wondering what you should have done differently. That may be the deepest tragedy in Paul Hogan's story. Not that his marriage is ended. Not that his fame faded. Not even that age eventually caught up with him. It is that time cannot be negotiated with. The things you fail to appreciate when you are young do not necessarily wait for you to become wise. Sometimes they move on. Nolene built another life. Linda built another life. Their stories continued, and Paul was left with memories. At 86, memories are not small things. They are the places you can still visit when the real places have disappeared. The bridge, the pool, the early home, the first marriage, the outback, the Crocodile Dundee set, the laughter, the red carpets, the people who once stood beside him. Maybe that is why the question of who was the love of Paul Hogan's life feels so powerful. Because the answer depends on what kind of love you mean. If you mean the woman who shared the years when the world knew his name, Linda's place in his story is undeniable. If you mean the woman who knew him before anyone cared who he was, Nolene's place is impossible to erase. One woman knew the celebrity. One woman knew the young man. And Paul Hogan had to live long enough to understand the difference. There is a certain sadness in realizing that the person you once thought would always be there has become a memory. But there is also something beautiful about knowing that your life mattered to someone before the world ever applauded. That may be the part of Hogan's story that deserves to be remembered most. Not the knife. Not the hat. Not the box office numbers. Not the celebrity parties. The beginning. A 19-year-old man. An 18-year-old woman. A simple decision to get married. A family built from almost nothing. And a lifetime that became much larger than either of them could have imagined. Years later, after fame had arrived and disappeared, after Hollywood had changed, after marriages had ended and children had grown up, that beginning remained. Because fame can introduce you to millions of people. But it cannot recreate the person who knew you before you became famous. Paul Hogan may always be remembered as Mick Dundee. But somewhere beneath that character is still the young man from Western Sydney who met Nolene Edwards in 1958 and had no idea that his life was about to become a story. Perhaps that is why the oldest memories can become the loudest ones. When the noise of success finally becomes quiet, the mind does not necessarily return to the biggest moments. It returns to the smallest ones. A familiar voice. A shared meal. A child asleep in another room. Someone asking how your day was when nobody else in the world cared. Those moments are almost invisible while they are happening. Yet decades later, they can carry more weight than a premiere watched by millions. Paul Hogan's life contains both kinds of memories. There are the spectacular memories that belong to history, and there are the private memories that belong only to the people who lived them. Perhaps the real cost of fame was not losing privacy. Perhaps it was learning too late that privacy had once been another word for peace. And if that is the lesson Hogan carries with him now, it may be the most honest ending his story could have. When you are young, you look forward. When you are old, you look back. And when you look back long enough, you begin to see that the greatest moments were not always the ones the world noticed. Sometimes they were the quiet years. The first home. The children. The person waiting for you after work. The person who knew your real name before millions knew your stage name. Those moments do not make headlines. But they can become the memories you carry when everything else is gone. So when people ask who Paul Hogan's true love was, perhaps there is no answer simple enough for a headline. Maybe the truth is that he loved two women in two completely different chapters of his life. Maybe one was the love that transformed him, and the other was the love that knew him. Maybe one gave him the Hollywood years, and the other gave him the beginning. And perhaps the hardest lesson of all is that sometimes you only understand the value of a chapter after it has already ended. At 86, Paul Hogan has lived long enough to see the difference between being famous and being known. Millions knew Mick Dundee. Far fewer knew Paul Hogan. And the people who knew Paul before the character existed may have known the most important version of him of all. Because when the cameras stop rolling, the red carpets disappear, and the laughter becomes a memory, the question is no longer who loved the star. It is who loved the man. And that is a question no movie could ever answer.